Hey guys, I'm giving speeches. I'll be at the Connecticut Libertarian Party State Convention on January the 29th and then February the 26th at the state convention in Utah, in Salt Lake City there. So, I don't know, look it up. All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Richard Hanania from Defense Priorities. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Scott. How are you?
I'm doing really good. Really appreciate you joining us here on the show today. And, you know, I finally got a chance to look through a couple of your studies here. First of all, Phantom Empire, the illusionary nature of U.S. military power. And I had missed this one from last spring or early summer, I guess. The inevitable rise of China. So if it's all right, I wanted to start with the Phantom Empire. What do you mean by that?
So basically, the U.S., whenever it's abroad and there's discussions about what it's doing in any particular country, the idea is put forth that basically the U.S. needs to be somewhere because it advances American interests, it advances American geopolitical power. So this is a natural way to think about things. I mean, most of the time when countries have occupied other countries, they've usually gotten something out of it. Sometimes, usually by force or threatening to use force against another country. And, the American empire really doesn't work like that. I mean, it has troops all over the world, and sometimes it's allies that it defends. Sometimes the U.S. wants to be in those countries more than the countries want them there. The U.S. is there supposedly to protect them. And also often the American presence doesn't really have much of an influence on their politics because the U.S. wants to be there. Like I just said, the U.S. wants to be there often more than the countries themselves want them there. So the U.S. foreign policy establishment desperately wants to be in Germany. The U.S. has no leverage over Germany because it has troops there, because they want them there. The U.S. wants them there. And so, Germany is going to a large extent its own way on foreign policy on the issue of Russia and Ukraine, what they really care about right now. And so, that's the basic idea, that sort of power flows from the American military presence rather than other sources. There's just no reason to think that.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying here that, I guess, you're tacitly acknowledging America does overthrow governments, but you say they don't really overthrow friendly governments. I guess there was that one time they overthrew the government in Australia, but usually they don't do that, right? And so you're saying that's the joke is you got the Marines there, but nobody thinks they're going to do anything if you don't do what they say.
Yeah, they overthrow governments, but usually it's not because of like the American military base, right? They usually don't send tanks to overthrow governments. I mean, they have done that a few times to Middle Eastern dictatorships. The U.S. overthrows governments, all the time, from Lindsay O'Rourke's research and other places. We all know that, but it's pretty disconnected to where American troops are stationed abroad.
But you're saying because, say, for example, in Germany, they don't fear that if they cross the Pentagon that the CIA is going to come and overthrow them or something like that. They know that we won't cross that line.
Well, so. maybe they do. I mean, maybe it depends on what kind of government they have. Maybe they do. But the point is, the American they're not going to use the American military to do it, or very very unlikely to use it. Nobody thinks that.
Mm-hmm. But then, so I see your point. I don't know if there's good examples of this where. Maybe there's countries that they really want American troops there more than the Pentagon wants them there, or if maybe you have to go to other empires in history where people wanted the foreign bases there more than the empire that had them.
Well, I mean, like for example, Syria. The government of Syria right now probably wants the Russians there, or did. They pulled back. But when Russia was helping Syria, Syria was being defended by Russia. So it mattered a lot more to Syria than it did to Russia, although it did matter to Russia. I think the Eastern European countries, the ones that have been added to NATO recently, and like Ukraine, which wants to be in NATO, they care more about a U.S. alliance more than the U.S. does. And so it's not that uncommon. If American foreign policy was basically, if you took it at face value that about what we're doing abroad, we're defending all these countries against foreign threats, then it would make sense. You would expect those countries to want the U.S. there more than the U.S. wants to be there, right? Like whether South Korea gets conquered matters a lot more to South Korea than it does to the United States. Now, often, the Philippines, is sort of ambivalent about when and wants the U.S. there. I mean, it's a few times tried to kick the U.S. out, or the U.S. has had to bribe it. So that's in a situation where the U.S. wants to be there pretty much more than the Filipinos want them there. Something like Germany, it seems like the elites do want the U.S. there. The U.S. desperately wants to be there too. So it's it looks like it's about the same. But yeah, I mean, the U.S. has to, if the U.S. is going to get anything out of these military presence abroad, they're going to need, they would need to basically not want to be there or see it as a cost. And often they don't. I mean, they're horrified by any suggestion that the U.S. pull out of, any country where it has troops in, or take on any fewer military commitments than it has in the past. So this is, this removes any kind of leverage you might have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you point out in this study that even when Donald Trump is really just playing bad cop a little bit and saying, geez, I don't know, maybe I'll pull out of Germany or maybe I'll pull out of Korea, that his own government shouts that he doesn't mean that. So whatever leverage he might have gotten is pretty much just wasted away.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the reaction to Trump when he would say, skeptical things about the U.S. presence in Korea or Germany. I mean, it was really over the top. You saw that, the media and the foreign policy establishment and the political elites. I mean, they consider this kind of blasphemy. Pulling out of Afghanistan. I mean, you could see sort of the reaction to that in the media. So yeah, there's a general bias towards interventionism, or at least not pulling back from any commitments that the U.S. has at the moment, and the rest of the world can observe our politics. So they're not, it's not a mystery to them what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say that, I guess a lot of the foreign affairs types will cite trade relationships and say, well, we have such a good relationship in trade with the European Union, with Japan, with Korea, and that's because of our military relationship. Look at all this stability. You wouldn't want to undermine that, would you?
Well, so yeah, I mean, there's like a basic argument that the U.S. has that helps develop the relationship, and you have more trade. I don't think anyone has had a good explanation of how exactly that works. The other argument is the U.S. Keeps things stable, and because it supports stability in these countries and in these regions, that benefits the U.S. through trade and investment and so on, just global commerce. And that depends on whether you think the U.S. is a force for stability. Often, I think it's not. I mean, the U.S. The U.S. Rivalry with Russia right now is based to a large extent on the fact that the U.S. wants to bring, or potentially wants to bring, Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And when Georgia launched a war to reclaim South Ossetia, basically because they wanted to settle that issue, and they wanted to settle that issue because that would help them get the NATO membership. So the NATO membership, which is supposed to create stability, is really creating instability by making Russia feel encircled and making it respond to American action. So I don't. You could have to look at every region individually, but it's not obvious that the U.S. is actually providing a lot of stability.
Yeah. It's ironic. I talked with Clint Ehrlich, who you may have seen on the Tucker Carlson show, this guy who's a Russia analyst, and he was pointing out that not just France and Germany, but that even the United States does not want to bring Ukraine into NATO, and they haven't under Obama, under Trump, and under Biden. They're just stuck on this thing that, well, the Russians can't tell us what to do. We'll be damned if we're going to let another country close the door on NATO membership for somebody. We'll decide. But the whole thing is, they already have decided that they don't really want to do this. And yet now they're going the other direction just because Putin's complaining about it.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true. I mean, they don't want to bring in NATO today, but if you read Adam Tooze's recent Substack on what's going on with Russia, the Ukraine, they were taking steps to do so. I mean, they were encouraging Ukraine to sort of,
Yeah,
have
no, wait. I
observers.
mean, George W. Bush promised them in the Budapest Memorandum then.
Exactly. So I think what the foreign policy elites wants, I mean, they don't want to move on it. It's too provocative and it's too complicated to do it now. But I don't have any doubt that foreign policy elites in the U.S. hope that in 10, 20 years, Ukraine is in NATO. They're playing the long game here, and that's why they want to keep the door open. And I think Russia can see what they're doing. So I don't think I don't think they've decided it's not worth it. I wish they did, but I don't think they have.
Yeah. Well, for a while there, I was counting on Angela Merkel to stand in between these guys, and now she's gone, so I don't know. But she was
Well,
the one
yeah.
who really insisted too that they do the Minsk II deal to end the war in East Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I mean, Germany is blocking weapons transfers to Ukraine through Estonia, and it's not as cooperative as America would like. So Germany, is still there,
Right.
preventing a united front. I mean, because they depend on Russia. I mean, they depend on Russia for their gas. They're trying
Right.
to finish the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and in the face of American pressure. So yeah, I mean, if Russia was this big aggressive country, I mean, you'd think that every other country in the world, every other country in the region would unite against them, and that's not what we're seeing.
Right. Yeah. Hey, as Victoria Nuland said, F the EU. And what that meant was the Germans are taking too long to do the coup. So we're going to go ahead and do it without them. That was what she was complaining about right there in that part of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
call.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so you see, this just the propaganda. I mean, is just so crazy because it's like, oh, Russia's interfering in the affairs of other countries. We have a rules-based international order. Everyone can choose their alliances, and it's like if you to believe this stuff, you have to be like completely ignorant of American foreign policy and what it's been doing. I mean, if you have any like clue of American foreign policy, all this stuff just sounds ridiculous. But the propaganda apparently works.
Mhm. Yeah, in the now famous Defense One piece by Evelyn Farkas, who had worked for Obama, she talked about how since the end of the Cold War, no borders have changed through violent force. And if we let Russia change that, it'll crumble the entire rules-based international order. And I thought, wow, she's never really heard of the 1999 Kosovo War, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Or when
I mean,
America just gave part of Western Sahara to Morocco in exchange for them making a trade deal with Israel.
yeah, exactly. And even like look at Crimea. I mean, basically Russia took it over and the world didn't crumble, right?
Right.
This stuff doesn't matter. I mean, there is a good, there is the fact that there's a norm against territorial conquest and it's happening less often is a good thing. And I wish the U.S. would contribute to upholding that norm by not invading other countries, and also the norm of sovereignty by not, encouraging coups against other countries or overthrowing other countries. Then it would be in a position to point out the bad behavior of other states. But we're in no position morally to do that.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, did you see Rand Paul's piece in the American Conservative magazine? And he was the one Republican in the Senate who voted no on Ted Cruz's thing about this. But Rand Paul
Uh,
said, listen, all this fight about Nord Stream 2 is mercantilism. They're protecting Texas natural gas exporters who want a monopoly on selling CH4 to the Germans. And so here, this is playing this outsized role in the fomenting of a new Cold War with Russia. Just some
yeah.
money.
Yeah. Rand Paul has been a consistent voice on the Republican side, one of fewer, if any, consistently opposed to this stuff. I mean, Mike Lee too has been a little bit, has been to a certain extent against NATO expansion. I think he voted against one or two of the countries being brought in the last few years. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't know if mercantilism. I mean, I don't know if that's an insult to Republicans now because they're sort of open that they're protectionist. But it's sort of silly for Ted Cruz to get up there and say, "Oh my, put Putin's pipeline," right? It's like where another country gets its natural gas from. I mean, it's not really his business.
Right. And now, yeah, I mean, that's the thing about that term interests, right? They used to sometimes say vital interests, But then they just get to interests, which really could just mean the interests of one or two companies in one of the 50 states. And then that counts.
Yeah, they often don't tell you what the national interest is, right? It can be ideological. It could be sort of they have these things about establishing deterrence or like protecting national honor, and you always have to sort of think carefully about what exactly they're arguing for and what arguments they're making, because it's not always clear.
Yeah. Now, you bring up some specific policies of South Korea and for that matter, the Philippines and Vietnam and Germany and other NATO allies, where they just do whatever they want when it comes to dealing with the Chinese or dealing with the Russians, like on this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, where the military alliance that we have and even our stationing of forces in their countries seem to have no effect whatsoever on the decisions that they're making there. Could you elaborate a bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, because for the reasons I said before, the U.S. really wants to be there, so they don't have much leverage from the presence in any particular country. For example, Germany with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which the U.S. really has wanted not to go forward, and then you have in South Korea, you have basically it's accepted Huawei as to come into the country, and that's been fine with that. That has been a really big American priority in East Asia. South Korea is generally had tried to get along with China. I mean, they've not denounced it for anything it's done internally. It hasn't cared about its issues with Hong Kong or Taiwan. South Korea, in recent years, has been often more friendly towards opening relations with North Korea than the U.S. is under Moon. I mean, you could go to different parts of the world, and you could see this, and we could see it in the Middle East. The U.S. At least has a commitment to defend Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is doing all kinds of crazy things, everything from the Khashoggi murder to the war in Yemen, which the U.S. got behind sort of reluctantly, but nobody can see how it helps American interests. You could look at every. So the report goes and looks at basically these different regions of the world and shows what are we doing? What is the American influence here that comes from the defense relationship?
Right. Now, see, I always just sit here and moralize about who's getting killed and all this stuff, but I appreciate the academic take, too, where you just sort of go, look, we got to do some ones and zeros and some rational analysis here, and it looks like every time we occupy a country, our rivals benefit the most. For example, Iraq and Afghanistan, where Iran and Al-Qaeda in Iraq benefited, and China and Pakistan, I guess, more than anybody else in Afghanistan, but certainly America didn't get anything whatsoever out of either of those wars.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so strange because they're like, oh, we need to build a stable democracy, in Afghanistan, and that's what they were trying to do for 20 years. And it's like, okay, if you did do that, like, so what? Like, Afghanistan's biggest trading partner, with the U.S. during the U.S. occupation, the biggest trading partners were Iran and China. And so, like, if it's about keeping Iran, if it's like about pushing America, assuming like what they say that Iran and China are American enemies, then why are we invading Afghanistan and then like letting it build relationships with these countries and build economic ties? There's no sort of connection to logic here. And of course, you and your audience know about the war in Iraq, how it basically made Iran stronger more than anyone else. I mean, Iraq is also has pretty good relations with China too, and so there's really no connection between sort of these foreign policy adventures and the national interest, even if you sort of take what they're saying at face value. It's sort of as if the war is sort of the point of the war is the war, and then they come up with a justification later.
Yeah, give me just a minute here. Listen, I don't know about you guys, but part of running the Libertarian Institute is sending out tons of books and other things to our donors. And who wants to stand in line all day at the post office? But Stamps.com? Sorry, but their website is a total disaster. I couldn't spend another minute on it. But I don't have to either, because there's EasyShip.com. EasyShip.com is like Stamps.com, but their website isn't terrible. Go to scotthorton.org/EasyShip. Hey, y'all, Scott here. The Libertarian Institute has published a few great books. Mine, Fool's Errand, Enough Already, and The Great Ron Paul. 2 by our executive editor Sheldon Richman, Coming to Palestine and What Social Animals Owe to Each Other. And of course, No Quarter, The Ravings of William Norman Grigg, our late great co-founder and managing editor at the Institute. Coming very soon in the new year will be the excellent Voluntarist Handbook, edited by Keith Knight, a new collection of my interviews about nuclear weapons, 1 more collection of essays by Will Grigg, and 2 new books about Syria by the great William Van Wagenen and Brad Hoff and his co-author, Zachary Wingard. That's libertarianinstitute.org/books. It does seem like that, doesn't it? That either that or these geniuses really just aren't that smart or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most celebrated foreign policy wise men of at least the previous generation was Zbigniew Brzezinski. And I pointed out in my book about how in 1997 in the Grand Chessboard, he said, listen, we have got to back the Chinese, Pakistan, Taliban axis in Afghanistan to keep the Iranians, the Russians, and the Indians out. But then that's the exact opposite of the war that we fought for 20 years. It was to back the Hazaras, the Iranians' friends, and the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, the Russians, and the Indians' friends, to keep the Pakistanis' friends, the Taliban, out.
Yeah.
And then, as you said, even during the war, the Chinese were the biggest investors in the place. But I wonder if there's a point where, you know, it's easy to imagine, I guess, either way, right? That they're saying, excellent, now we've created a crisis, now we can solve that, and then we'll switch sides again and whatever. But it's also pretty easy to imagine that all of them are complete idiots, right? Like the Supreme Court justice last week talking about 100,000 children in the ICU or whatever. They just don't even know what they're talking about at all, these people. So they'll back the Shiite side in Iraq while they're backing the Sunni side in Syria at the same damn time, this kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the theme of my recent book, Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy. You know, they get where the politicians get where they are by being good at politics, and being good at politics doesn't mean you have to actually know anything. You just have to, look good in front of voters and convince them to vote for you. And then the people who are like foreign policy people working at think tanks or working in government, they're either selected by the politicians. Often they're supported by weapons manufacturers. They're supported by foreign governments, and they're often looking for people who will say the things they want them to say. So the generals now, they all go work for defense contractors. I mean, as soon as they're or some other kind of federal government contractors, as soon as they retire, and they say the things that are in their interest to say, and it doesn't have to make sense. You're right. I mean, we supposedly hate Iran, and then we get rid of their enemy Saddam Hussein, and then we have to stay there because we have to fight Iran, and then we're against Al Qaeda, and then the Islamists try to overthrow the government of Libya. We help them, and then we go to Syria, and then we help the other Islamists try to overthrow a different government, and then we're in Syria to keep and then we go to Syria to keep the Iranians out, and it's all it's the people. Anyone can look at this and say this is ridiculous, but to these people who sort of have an interest in having it all make sense and keep pushing for the same policies, it's been very good for them.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing about it too, right? Is they always just fail upwards. And I can't believe you wrote a book called that. That sounds so fun. Really. I have a subchapter of my book. It's called Public Choice Theory, about how we got into the war in Libya. But
oh wow, I should have. I'm sorry, I haven't read your book.
Let's trade books. Yeah, we'll get this done. But no, I like that. And public choice theory, could you just describe for people real quick in a nutshell what that means?
So public choice theory is basically you're taking the tools of economics and you're using it to understand politics, right? So there's this sort of, if you have standard sort of international relations analysis, I mean, it's you could have a very naive thing where these people are, know what they're doing, and they're sitting there and they're coming up with a strategy to advance the American interest or, accomplish something in geopolitically. And so, that's one way of looking at the world. The other way of looking at politics is basically, they're self-interested actors, and every part of the system is there. You look at the parties and you look at what their incentives are. So the idea is, what are the incentives of politicians? The incentive of politicians is to get elected. What is the incentive of a voter? Well, the voter is just, they don't have an incentive to really pay attention to foreign policy or anything else. I mean, they're doing things, they're deciding things based on what sounds good. And then you have the military establishment, and you have different factions. I mean, the one of the main lessons of public choice theory, I mean, going back to Mancur Olson, is the idea that groups with a concentrated interest in a policy outcome are more likely to get their way against groups with a diffuse interest. So if you're a weapons contractor and most or all of your revenue comes from the government, like, say, which is the case for something like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, you have an interest into lobbying for outcomes that are good for yourself. And people who might have an interest in the more diffuse interests, in the sense that they do not individually gain the taxpayer or the rest of society, they don't have an incentive to push for the opposite policy outcome than the one that the concentrated interest wants. And so I think that this is the way to understand American foreign policy. If you go into it and you look for coherence, right? You look for, say, we're enforcing the rules-based international order, or we are the shining city on the hill, or we're trying to establish like dominance and push other people around. Even the more cynical takes on American foreign policy. I don't think foreign policy makes sense from that perspective. But if you look at it as sort of just a bunch of people trying to continue getting paid and continue getting power, and sometimes they believe it, but they believe it because they're supported by other people who have a direct interest in an outcome, or they believe it because it's good for their job. And then you sort of look at the policy as sort of in a sense, a series of accidents from like the macro level, from the level of what is good for the country as a whole, or what is good for the world as a whole. That's just a better way to understand foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. There was one report was by Josh Rogan, and I can't remember who did the other, but there were 2 or 3 reports about the conversation on the carpet in the Oval Office when they decided on Libya. And you had the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor, and the Deputy National Security Advisor, and the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and the Vice President, and a few others saying, no, we should not do this. And then on the other side, you had Hillary Clinton, Samantha Power, and Susan Rice. And they wanted to do it, and all 3 of them wanted to do it for their own reasons. As Michael Hastings reported, Samantha Power was tired of doing rinky-dink do-gooder stuff on the National Security Council, where she had a deputy spot or something, and wanted to move up and get a promotion, which worked. She became the ambassador to the United Nations. And then Rice got promoted from ambassador to the United Nations to National Security Advisor. And then this was obviously supposed to be a feather in Hillary Clinton's cap for when she ran for president in 2016, that she'd done this great war, as is revealed in all her emails with Jake Sullivan and Sidney Blumenthal and others. That this had nothing whatsoever to do with the people of Libya. It was about these 3 women and their ambitions. And then Obama sided with them over the Secretary of Defense, telling him, we already got 2 wars, and I don't know if we need another one right now since we were losing these 2.
Yeah, I mean, Obama said it was a 51-49 decision. I mean, right. To go to war, I mean, you think you'd want more certainty than that. And these, it's hard to say, whether they just wanted a promotion, or even if they're like, they're ideological. I mean, some people really believe that the U.S. can do good across the world. I mean, it's in the face of all evidence, based on our interventions, but, presumably some people believe that. And, the point is, I mean, none of them, but whatever you think their motivations are, the point is none of them thought much carefully about what would come after. I mean, it's not like they had a plan for who was going to rule Libya instead. instead, it was just like, let's break the government, and then hopefully something, good will work out, right? Even if for their own political interests. I mean, Libya became, sort of if anything, it became a hindrance to Hillary's political ambitions because, because of Benghazi and because everyone realized that Libya was a disaster. So it wasn't like something she could point to and say, I'm so proud we did this. It was something she really wanted to forget by 2016. But yeah, maybe that's just her not being good at political calculations, or maybe just as I don't know if it's more pessimistic or optimistic to believe she actually believed this and thought that foreign intervention is good for the world and good for her politics because she thinks it's all going to work out. But if she thinks that there's there was a certain delusion there.
Right. Well, and the point is, right, she doesn't have to bear any of the costs.
Of course not. Yeah.
Her friend Anne-Marie Slaughter said, well, Hillary's point of view is that if something is going on and there could be bad consequences either way, then she would rather be caught trying. Because that's better than doing nothing, right? And then it probably did cost her the presidency, in fact, though. You know what I mean? I think Libya probably was worth a couple percentage points here and there.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. Yeah, I mean, I think because of the Benghazi thing more than actual destroying Libya, because the Republicans were able to make a big scandal out of that. But yeah, it's certainly plausible. Yeah, it's it's such a the world is so complex that if you're just going to have a bias towards doing something, there's a lot more ways to break things than there are to make things better. And that philosophy is going to lead you to break a lot of things. Maybe once in a while you'll sort of stumble into something good. Most of the time you probably won't, because our government doesn't have the vision and the foresight and the knowledge to remake foreign countries. They barely can govern their own country. Our state has not been doing so well. So the idea that we're in position to say, this government is bad and should be replaced by something else, and we can sort of midwife or facilitate that process. I don't know where they get the confidence to believe this.
Right. Especially when it's all this foreign interventionism is at the root of what's wrong with the country falling apart the way it is right now. If just starting with the $10 trillion, but all the societal consequences and everything else of just having the 21st century based around the idea of war in the Middle East this whole time, the way it's been. It didn't have to be this way at all. They want to know why they're losing credibility to dictate to other countries. It's the dictating to other countries that's cost them their credibility, in every way, it seems like. All right, so wait, here's a segue to our next conversation here about China, which is that you talk about Vietnam, which, funny enough, despite our failed effort to keep the communists from taking over that country in the 1970s, we got a pretty good relationship with them now, but not as good as we have with the Philippines or Japan. And you say that they're the ones who are most antagonistic towards the Chinese in the region, as opposed to South Korea or the Philippines, who the Americans would like to take a more antagonistic stance. Is that right?
Yeah, and so that's the flip side of the coin. The argument is, the U.S. is very close to South Korea. Basically, South Korea depends on the U.S. For its defense, and South Korea really doesn't do what the U.S. wants. And Vietnam, the U.S. doesn't have a defense relationship. They have, normalized relations now, but the U.S. basically doesn't, guarantee that it's going to defend Vietnam, or that it's going to, or doesn't station troops in Vietnam. And yet Vietnam is increasing its military spending more than anyone else in the region, and seems scared, seems frightened of China for its own reasons. And that's just sort of the flip side of the coin. Having a strong military relationship doesn't seem correlated with that country doing what the United States wants towards China, and not having a great relationship with the United States doesn't seem correlated with not doing what the U.S. wants. Right? They might end up antagonistic to China. So it's just the point that the U.S. relationship system is not really related to American interests or American effectiveness in seeking out what it wants.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, maybe we have a hard time hurting our cats on our side, but isn't it important that we deter Russia from invading Eastern Europe and deter China from conquering Taiwan first and Japan second?
Well, I mean, so Russia. I mean, you have to look at capabilities and intentions, right? Russia does not want basically. There's no indication that it's going to go invade its neighbors. To the extent that there is indication that they're going to do so, that there's some indication now that they might go into Ukraine, and by the time your listeners hear this, it might have actually happened already. But yeah, the reason, as we talked about, is the reason that the antagonism with Ukraine in the first place is because the U.S. has basically been the U.S. Has basically been trying to bring that country into NATO. It's been trying to bring it into its own sphere of influence. Russia considers it historically a very important part, sort of the mother. Kiev is sort of the mother of Russian civilization. Ukraine doesn't matter to the U.S. either way. I mean, there's no part of the world that matters less. I mean, the Balkans and Eastern Europe don't matter either. I mean, these places, the U.S. after World War II was happy to, not happy to, but it lived with giving them to putting them under Soviet influence or letting them be under Soviet influence. Nobody considered that something worth fighting for. The U.S. could have, tried to go to war and dislodge the Soviet Union from Eastern Europe, but nobody was calling for us to do that because people understand these regions just don't matter. And then in East Asia, similarly, I mean, the U.S. China sees Taiwan as part of China. They care about that issue much more than we do. Is it worth the U.S. going to war to stop China? I mean, people try to come up with reasons. They say semiconductors. You can still buy the semiconductors from China. I mean, there's no reason you couldn't. There's no reason you couldn't invest. Any investment for the market to adjust to new conditions will be cheaper than a war. And then the idea that China would go to war with Japan. Japan is one of the most technologically advanced countries in the world. It can have a nuclear weapon in months if it wanted to. And it can defend itself. Now, what incentive does China have to go after it? I mean, it would be pretty disastrous. So yeah, I think these are sort of it takes a lot of imagination to sort of imagine these scenarios in which the U.S. needs to be there to prevent some kind of one of these countries going on a war path. I mean, there's little indication that that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Gareth Porter wrote this piece about how they had a policy called dual deterrence, about how they would let China know periodically that, listen, we really don't want you reunifying with Taiwan by force. That would be really bad. But at the same time, they would, not making a direct threat, but sort of implying one. But at the same time, they would tell the Taiwanese, especially I don't know if you call them the right, the more nationalist, independence-minded ones, that you guys need to pipe down with all your provocative statements about declaring full independence and sovereignty, because they see that obviously as needlessly provocative and could actually cause the war. But of course, the Taiwanese feel like the more F-16s they got and the more American Navy ships around they have, then maybe, the more confident that they feel, or overconfident, to kind of, get louder and talk more about independence. So it seems like it could really be, in other words, a self-fulfilling prophecy, where if they didn't feel like we had their back, they might actually mind their manners and be happy with the autonomy that they have and leave it at that instead of picking a fight, since they figure that we're going to win it for them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, when you're trying to do this, yeah. So the U.S. foreign policy establishment, it's not as if they just want everything to be as aggressive as possible. They don't like to be surprised, and they don't like sudden moves that can force them to do something that's politically potentially difficult. And the problem when you're playing these both sides, you're telling China, don't move into Taiwan, and you're telling Taiwan, don't antagonize China too much. I mean, you're trying to do too much. You're trying to manage these complex relations, and the potential for miscalculation is very high. So Georgia had provoked the war with Russia in this during the Bush administration because they thought that the U.S. had their back, and it turns out that we didn't. We weren't ready to do anything about Georgia, right? And so you can see the same thing with Ukraine. Ukraine is a lot more belligerent than it otherwise would be towards Russia because it thinks Europe and the U.S. will potentially bail it out, or that eventually they're gonna come into NATO, and they're going to have, the U.S. Just right there and with an ironclad commitment to defend them against Russia. So yeah, I think it's better if these relationships between these countries reflect the power realities on the ground. And American intervention is often, is more often a source of instability here than it is a source of stability and peace.
Mm-hmm. All right, now you're convinced in this piece that, especially looking forward 2 and 3 and 4 decades from now, that China absolutely is getting rich and will be the dominant power in all of Asia. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, right. I mean, look, middle income, China has passed the U.S. on GDP, depending on how you measure, or it's going to pass it, the next decade or so. China has 1.4 billion people. It's a highly innovative economy. It's really an outlier at how innovative it is for a middle income country. And so it's the population size plus the innovation plus the growth in the coming decades. China will be the biggest economy in the world. I mean, unless something, extreme happens, you can't tell the future with certainty, but that's what you have to expect to be the most likely outcome. And then given that's the case, what are we going to do with that information? Are we going to artificially try to keep the same level of American influence in East Asia and the American dominance that existed back when China was a third world country and basically, had limited power to project abroad and limited economic links with the rest of the world? I don't think that that's a realistic policy. So I think we're going to have to, really get used to. I mean, and we're in the growing pains of it now. We're going to really have to get used to a bipolar world, really more multipolar. I mean, and you could, India is also growing, and there's potentially, potentially other countries out there that can rise if they get their house in order. And Russia, is not the economically the strongest in the country, but definitely militarily, it's certainly a force in its region. It's a bigger force than the U.S. and Eastern Europe as far as having ground troops. The sort of denial of power realities, we can see this in this is never a good thing in foreign policy. This was what we saw in Afghanistan, where the Afghan government was a house of cards and the Taliban was a real fighting and potentially governing force, and we tried to sort of delay the inevitable there. And I think we're hoping for things that are really not possible in East Asia, given the power dynamics. And the report is an argument for not doing that and taking a more realistic approach.
Sorry, hang on just 1 second. Hey guys, anybody who signs up to listen to this show by way of Patreon will be invited to join the Reddit group, and I'm gonna start posting stuff over there more. That's patreon.com/Scott Horton Show. Thanks. Hey y'all, LibertasBella.com is where you get Scott Horton Show and Libertarian Institute shirts, sweatshirts, mugs, and stickers and things, including the great Top Lobsters designs as well. See, that way it says on your shirt why you're so smart. Libertas Bella, from the same great folks who bring you ammo.com for all your ammunition needs too. That's LibertasBella.com. You guys check it out. This is so cool. The great Mike Swanson's new book is finally out. He's been working on this thing for years. And I admit I haven't read it yet. I'm going to get to it as soon as I can, but I know you guys are going to want to beat me to it. It's called Why the Vietnam War: Nuclear Bombs and Nation Building in Southeast Asia, 1945 through 61. And as he explains on the back here, all of our popular culture and our retellings and our history and our movies are all about the height of the American war there in, say, 1964 through 1974. But how did we get there? Why is this all Harry Truman's fault? Find out in Why the Vietnam War by the great Mike Swanson. Available now. Well, so I wonder what you think about all the people on the right who are so concerned that we're not just seeing a rise of China in Asia, but that they're going to replace America as the unipolar world empire here, and we are going to be subject to their will here in North America.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, the idea that China has political influence in the U.S. I mean, there's no country in the world that is more immune to influence from other powers than the U.S. is. I mean, the U.S. supports non-government organizations and all these countries. It funds journalists and these things. It interferes in politics, and it dictates to countries, and it does this openly, right? So China, I mean, you could, they're an economic power, they're a military power. Are they a propaganda power? Do they have, a way to influence the American system? In certain ways they do. I mean, because businesses do want to do business with them, and there's, there's a potential for mutual benefit from trade. That's not an evil thing. I mean, that's what, that's how countries behave, and that's, that can be in the interest of all involved, when it's based on consent between the parties. But I think for the U.S. to, I think for people to get really excited about a more antagonistic approach to China, I think they really have to exaggerate sort of the harm of what China potentially can do to the United States, or what it potentially wants to do with the U.S., or its power to influence American politics. And I think these things tend to be very, very exaggerated for reasons, for whatever psychological reasons, or for whatever interest people have in a more conflictual approach to China.
Yeah. And I guess they would have the same problem that we have. It's a long way from here.
Yeah.
I don't know how they're supposed to dominate us, but I'll tell you what, I did meet a guy who...
Yeah, it's such a simple fact that, we forget this. Yes, they are a long way from here, right? That is a good thing to keep in mind, and people generally don't.
So the most credible thing I heard about that from somebody was, he started off talking about Africa, and I don't even really know the truth of this, but he was saying that millions now of Chinese have moved to Southern Africa. And that this is, ethnic replacement, man. This is real colonization going on here. And they could pull the same thing in Mexico in another 50 or 100 years. And there's so many Chinese that they got plenty to go around.
That's crazy. Look at the birth rate of Chinese and look at the birth rate of Africans, and then tell me there's an ethnic replacement in Africa. That is absolutely insane. China is having a population shrinkage, and they're having enough trouble getting their own birth rate up and just maintaining their numbers. Yeah. Right. I think this is a fantasy. I mean, millions of white people moved to Africa, right? I mean, in South Africa, there's Europeans all over the continent. I would bet there's more Europeans still than there are Chinese and Africans. I'm not sure about that. Oh yeah, of course, when you count the white South African population, right? So yeah, this seems like another one of those things. It's hard because you have to shoot down every one of these things individually, right? They say China is controlling the U.S. and you say no, that's not true. And then they say, oh, China is ethnically replacing the Africans and they're going to move into Mexico. And you say that's not true, and then they'll make up something else, right? And that's why it's so hard to argue with these people. And you have to understand that there's sort of a need to have an enemy.
Yeah. And that really is what it is. And it's funny, isn't it, too, how everybody understands this. Ike Eisenhower coined the phrase, you just can't escape that. Regulatory capture by the arms industries, or not just regulatory, but government capture by the arms industries. Everybody knows that that's what's going on here. Everybody knows that, the first time you ever find out, what's a think tank? Oh, well, that's the arms manufacturers pay these egghead weenie guys to sit around writing excuses for weapon sales. It's the open conspiracy right in front of all of us,
Yeah. You're absolutely, I mean, you're right. I think that people should know this, but, I think that, shouldn't underestimate how much, the propaganda at think tanks and in the media and from government. I mean, they work on somebody, that's why they invest so much money and effort into them. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of people who are genuine believers who just, accept the propaganda. They have maybe an instinct to, it's easy to convince people that foreigners are out to get them, and they don't have any personal experience. They don't know, anybody from China or anybody from Russia or anything. And I think it's very, very easy for people to buy into these things. And I think that, what people like you do and what I do is point out, like, look, the entire information space has been shaped with people who have very kind of narrow interests or have some kind of ideological interest. And they're not the people who they don't necessarily have the same ideas or the same interests as the rest of the country does. And I think, just pointing that out to people, that's one of the things I do in my book and I try to do in my writing. I think that's very important. So sort of discrediting this class to a large extent.
Yeah. All right. So how's the alliance system shaping up in the East now? We have Australia and South Korea and Japan. These are already our allies. but they're trying to kind of bring everybody really together to hem in the Chinese in a way. So what's the status of that project?
Yeah, so there is, talk that, of like the Quad, right, which is the U.S. and Australia, India, and Japan, right? They're going to have sort of an alliance, not officially against China, but, sort of really against China. And there's more, especially from like Australia. There is more of a sense of like, talking a big game about China. And so, but how much that actually translates, into something, really important. It's we'll see. It's easy for these countries to sort of tell the U.S. What the U.S. wants to hear. I think the better question to see what's going to happen in the next years is, do they invest more in their militaries? Do they actually take steps to not trade as much with China? There's little indication of that happening. So until you get to that point, I mean, the talk, the sort of the discourse and the way their attitudes towards China is not nothing. It's something, but I think to gauge sort of the extent of the importance of what's going on in countries moving towards the U.S., I think you need to look for some hard metrics there. I think what most countries in the region want, and what they've wanted for the previous decades, is they don't want to choose between the U.S. and China. They just want to trade with each of them, and they want to basically have sovereignty in their affairs, and they don't want to be forced to choose one side or the other. And the U.S., the sort of the raison d'etre of the foreign policy establishment is becoming to counter China. And so I think they're feeling a lot of pressure from the American side. In some cases, no, that they really just dislike China. I mean, Japan has had a tough relationship in the last decade with China, and India has their own conflict with China, right? They had this border dispute that's gone back many decades. But are these countries actually interested in a substantive alliance that will cost something on their end? Right, and it's yet to be proven if that's the case. I mean, the country like Japan, has very low birth rates, has very low economic growth. I mean, China is economically rising very quickly. It doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense that they'd want to pick a fight with China at this point. But they're hosting a lot of American troops, so maybe it doesn't matter to them either way, right? So yeah, we'll see what happens in the coming decades.
Now, I'm not sure if you saw this piece by John Mueller at the Quincy Institute a couple weeks ago there. China's been a failure at hegemony, so let's just chill. And, of course, John Mueller's the author of Overblown and the Stupidity of War, and pretty much a Cato guy when it comes to foreign policy. And he's saying, they're not very good at throwing their weight around. They're as clumsy as we are when it comes to that kind of thing. Their wolf warrior diplomacy just makes everyone resent them. And it's, and sort of to the point that you were bringing up there a second ago about how many neighbors they have. They have a lot of neighbors. It seems like each one of those countries, they got a dozen international borders surrounding them one way or the other. Seems like that's just enough to keep them busy, just trying to keep the peace at all times. Never mind trying to be the dominant force in Bhutan and Pakistan and Outer Mongolia and everywhere else too,
Yeah, I think that Mueller is right. I mean, I don't think they're very good at it. I don't think they want what the U.S. wants, right? The U.S. wants basically a veto over the internal politics of every country in the world, and China just doesn't care that much about what other countries do. So yeah, I mean, they're very limited. They're not very good at the propaganda game. They're not very good at sort of covert operations. China just has this has not been their strengths, and it's not something they've prioritized or cared about as much as other places do. I mean, they care about certain things, like they really care about making sure another country, doesn't recognize Taiwan, but they don't care, like, for example, whether you're a democracy or a dictatorship or how you get along with your neighbors. That's just not something that they're into. And I think the American sort of ambitions abroad and its sort of a sense of its role in the world is so expansive that we sort of project out other countries. Oh, of course, China's going to try to interfere in the affairs of other countries. countries and overthrow them and, do crazy things like invade Iraq like we did. And just because we do these crazy things and, we are sort of, taking an expansive view of our role in the world, doesn't mean that's how other countries are going to behave. And, we should keep that in mind.
Yeah. All right. Well, so tell me about the future then. You're the Deputy National Security Advisor, and you're writing our new national security strategy. Help me see what the next 30 years look like then, as far as how we should be dealing with China.
Okay, so so I mean, I think we should be pretty much, looking for a way to acknowledge the fact that China is going to be the dominant power in East Asia. I think one of the reasons that we have such antagonism towards China and Russia is because we have we still in the back of our mind believe that these countries are illegitimate because they don't have the same kind of government that we do. Russia should have. I think Russia is the ultimate target of the color revolutions. China, I think that it's the same thing here. It's like we think that the system is fundamentally illegitimate, and I think that we take regime change off the table, and we basically we acknowledge that it's not for us to decide how every country in the world lives. I think a lot of the tensions go away. So I would be more explicit on that point. Basically, I would not fund these sort of they call them civil society organizations, so they're basically pawns of or agents of American influence abroad. I think that you can encourage Taiwan to take responsibility for its own defense. It's a technologically very advanced country. It's a rich country. Does that mean it can hold out against China? Probably, probably not. I mean, so it's going to have to find a way to live in a sort of one country. I think you'd get a one country, two systems, right? I think that the Chinese haven't they're no longer a communist state. So I think they would basically limit Taiwan's autonomy, but they would end up basically the Taiwanese can live a very good life under Chinese rule or sort of under a neutral state. And so I think this is what we need. I think we need to basically step back from East Asia. I mean, it really doesn't matter much to us at all. Globally, I think the sanctions regime is really a war crime. I mean, what we've done to countries like Venezuela and Syria and Cuba, their own governments have serious problems, but we've made the problems of the people in these countries, much worse through cutting them off from the global economy. And I would not do any regime change wars. And I would focus on the things that we have in common that we care about. Things like nuclear proliferation, things like climate policy and energy policy and global pandemics. I mean, there's so many things that are actually important to the U.S. in a way that who rules over Eastern Ukraine is not important, right? And because we have these antagonistic relationships, we ignore cooperation on the important things, and we focus on where we disagree on these things that fundamentally aren't important to us or to the wider world. So yeah, I would have a less militaristic, less interventionist foreign policy, and one based on more on mutual respect and cooperation.
Yeah. Now, you write in here that the theory. I guess this was mostly from the University of Chicago, Milton Friedmanite types, that the more Chinese society becomes capitalistic, the more democratic their political system will become too.
Yeah, I wouldn't blame the University of Chicago or Milton Friedman types for that. The economists, I think that's more a view that was in like political science than it really was the economic people.
Okay. Well, and so you say that proved that there couldn't be anything more wrong, but I followed the footnote, and it was just a Hillary Clinton speech, so I thought that must have been a mistake. But I wonder, I mean, if you can't replay the counterfactual and all of that, but and I know it does sound, I guess, slightly utopian or whatever, but I don't know. I mean, it seemed to make sense on the face of it. But I was thinking that maybe the big variable at play is America's terror wars this whole century long so far. And that if our government hadn't been bathing in the blood of 2 million dead innocent people and backing Al-Qaeda in Libya and Syria and Yemen, and just the madness, the chaos that they've inflicted in Central Asia as well this whole time, that then when they talked about the Declaration of Independence and the natural rights of man and things like that, it wouldn't just sound like ridiculous propaganda from completely morally and financially bankrupt people in a collapsing empire. This is the kind of thing that maybe even Saudi society and Chinese society would have had to take seriously. That, the Americans talk all the time about how their Bill of Rights is better. And, geez, maybe we should have fairer trials. And maybe we should have an independent judiciary. And maybe we could have done a little bit better in pushing the best of our ideas of political freedom in the world if it wasn't for all the hypocrisy,
Yeah, I mean, so unquestionably, when the U.S. Does things like prosecute Julian Assange, when it invades other countries, even when we have like deep partisanship and deep problems with our system, the rest of the world does see that, and it does make us look hypocritical. It does take away much of our credibility. At the same time, we should I think there's a limit to what we can do. So even if we behave angelically, it doesn't necessarily mean every country is going to move in the direction that we'd like to move. And these countries, I mean, there are different historical points. You can't just say we're going to tear people should tear everything down and build a democracy. But we should, I think, be showing people what works. And the Soviet Union collapsed not because we supported an insurgency or anything, but because they saw that their economic system didn't work, and they wanted to try something else. I mean, they lost faith in their own system, and it seems like today, we don't care if our system is not working. We just want to force it down everyone's throat, right? These same people who think democracy is over in the U.S. and they keep talking about Trump and Republicans are basically ruining our democracy, and we're moving away from a democracy. They're at the same time wanting to force what they call democracy onto the rest of the world. And so you're right. I think it's I don't know how much our sort of moral rectitude can influence other countries, but I do think it's looking more and more ridiculous as time goes on.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too that they overthrow a democracy in a heartbeat if it stands in their way, like the one in Ukraine.
Yeah.
A democratically elected leader that leans toward Russia, well, forget him. We'll do a street putsch with a bunch of neo-Nazis to throw him right out of office, even when he agreed to new elections in a couple of months. Not good enough. And started a war over it. You know what I mean? That's what they think about democracy. And in fact, the only thing wrong with our country is that they haven't done a regime change in Moscow yet. And if they had back in, say, 2011, then Putin wouldn't have been able to destroy our democracy in 2016. Otherwise, everything else that our establishment has done to be the stewards of this nation and this world empire the last 20 or 30 years has been perfect.
I tweeted out today. There was a State Department. It put out a document, the top 5 Russian, points of Russian disinformation, most persistent disinformation myths, and one of them was Western civilization is falling apart because it's moving away from traditional values and because of multiculturalism and LGBTQ rights, and these are things that a lot of Americans actually believe. So to say this is just a narrative that Russia invented. That's very convenient for people who don't want to think that there's just actually Americans who just disagree with them very, very strongly on some things. And so there was this idea that, oh my goodness, the American people couldn't have elected somebody like Donald Trump, right? It was a few Russian Facebook ads. It wasn't something deep in our, in our culture and American politics. And you see the same thing on the right. Sometimes they blame China for dividing us, and it's just crazy. It's where do you see the Chinese presence in American political culture? So often, people want to believe certain narratives that flatter themselves. They want to absolve themselves of problems that they've caused within society, and then they want to blame it all on foreigners. And they think if they can convince people of that, they will get, they'll be able to obtain political power and sort of move the country in the direction that they want to go. And that's just an unfortunate sort of recurring theme of our politics.
Right. All right. Well, listen, thank you so much for doing the show today, Richard. It's been really great, and I really enjoy reading you, too.
It's been a pleasure, Scott. Thank you very much.
All right, you guys. That's Richard Hanania, and he is at Defense Priorities. Check out this one. It's called Phantom Empire, The Illusionary Nature of U.S. Military Power, and also The Inevitable Rise of China, U.S. Options with Less Indo-Pacific Influence. And his book is Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com,
antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.